I don't have to. If I just implemented this and put it somewhere in my pseudocode file, I'd have to go find it now. Howdy, folks. We're back with our Wordle pseudocode here. And when we were building the pseudocode, we actually went a little too fast. We put it all into one file. And so today we're going to look at how to split code into multiple files, how to split it into folders, why we would want to do that, and some best practices for it. Let's get into it. So we have our pseudocode here, and you're saying, okay, well, yeah, this isn't that bad. Great, here's our stuff. We have our functions in here. Can start game, handle guess, etc. Well, for one, we're missing a lot of functions here. Maybe not that one, but like get game type, get games to type in user. There's at least a dozen little helper methods that I haven't written in here. And as a project gets bigger, as a code file gets bigger, it starts to become more and more unwieldy to figure out where exactly your code is. Right now, if I say, hey, where is start game? It's at the bottom. It's at the bottom. Okay. Start game. Perfect. There's start game. Where is can start game? It's at the top. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense already because can start game and start game are probably pretty closely linked. And so maybe we don't want them to have problems. But here we have maybe, I don't even know there's 100 lines of code in this file. What if we had 1,000 lines of code? What if we had 10,000 lines of code? I worked on a project once. It was a ticketing system for a small ISP. That particular ticketing system was 30,000 lines of PHP code in one single file. And what we ended up doing, those of us who worked on it, well, I say those of us who worked on it, there was 2 people who worked on it, and then eventually it was just me. We just kind of vaguely remembered that, oh, the function that creates the tickets is somewhere around line 12,000. The function that knows how to get data from the database for display, because this was PHP, old school PHP, the actual display code HTML was in this file as well. That code is somewhere around line 20,000 if you're doing the main page, but the actual individual ticket page is somewhere around line 5,000 because it was earlier on. It was a mess. And that's the reason that we like using directory structures, because cognitive load, and this is something that I may have brought up in some other videos, and I'm probably going to bring it up in the future. Cognitive load, when you're looking at code, is already going to be really high. You're looking at code, you're looking at this, you're trying to figure out what this does. So you're parsing syntax, you're parsing words, you're trying to figure out what do these words mean, what's the context of this. Latest start time, I have to figure out, okay, this is camel case, so I know that, I mean, that's one thing. Like, imagine if I wrote it like this. That is slightly harder to read, and that increases your cognitive load. That's why we use camel cases, because it clearly indicates the words, which gives you just maybe a quarter of a second faster read time of that line. That's important because as software engineers, architects, programmers, whatever, we're going to be reading tens of thousands of lines of code a day usually. We're not often going to be writing tens of thousands of lines of code a day. Sometimes I have actually had work where I've just found a bug and it was one character to fix, and I fixed one single character, and that took me 2 days to find. And during that process, I read thousands of lines of code and had to process what it was doing. So the better your system is set up, the easier it is to get to that point. And maybe if the system had been set up a little bit better, it would have taken me 1 day instead of 2 to find that bug. So that's why we really want to reduce our cognitive load. Good typing, good names, the syntax of your language really helps with this too. Like, I've picked a pseudo language that's specifically very simple. I can kind of understand what this is. Though this syntax is actually a little hard, right? This is a JavaScript arrow function. That's a little hard to process unless you know what you're looking at. So maybe you would pick something different. And so the language also can make things harder, but you can't really do anything about that. What you can do is make sure that your functions are commented. So for example, here, I'm saying what's going on, what's happening, which helps because I can read the comments and see what a complicated line might be doing, but also keep it short. I could have taken this can start game and put this in start game here. Instead, this is an easy sentence to parse because if I'm just trying to figure out how start game works, I say, oh, I'm calling can start game, and I just assume that function knows what to do. I don't need to think about it. I just know what it does. if I've written the code badly, maybe it doesn't do that, or maybe it doesn't do that very well, but that's a problem for another day. If I take this whole block and I put a comment on it, that's a little bit harder to process because now I have to look over all these lines to realize, oh yes, this is all whether I can start the game, and that might not be what I care about. So that becomes the same with directories as well. Now, the way that I handle directories is a mixture of commonalities and or common best practices and what I just personally enjoy. I would recommend you do the same. If you're working on a team or at a company, of course, you want to use what your team structure uses, and often most teams will have a previous structure that you can follow along with, and you'll get to know that structure pretty well. If you're working on your own thing, do whatever works for you. That's the whole point. You want to do whatever makes you the most comfortable because this is a system for you. Just like designing in pseudocode, as long as you can read your pseudocode and whoever needs to read it can read it, whoever needs to read your pseudocode can read it, that's probably okay. It doesn't need to have some consistent thing because you're not actually executing that. There are some libraries and frameworks that have a certain directory structure, like, for example, if you're using handlebars, it expects files to be in certain places, and then you kind of have to do that. Directories really help with breaking up code, and I'll show you why. So I'll show you an example. Let's say we have a bunch of models, right? So I'm just going to put models game dot code. I'm just going to use dot code for a kind of language agnostic code. Word.code, yes.code, and then game settings.code, or game type, I think it was. So now, if I was to say the get game function, let's say there was a bug in this function, I wanted to find this code. What file is that probably in? It's probably in this one, because this clearly has to do with the data for the game model, which means that probably belongs in the file responsible for that. So you can already see, I don't have to, if I just implemented this and put it somewhere in my pseudocode file, I'd have to go find it now. I'd have to say, hey, where is this function? Where did this go? Similarly, get word probably belongs in word.code. And that's why when you have an IDE up, which we'll do in the next video, you have your, well, I keep it on the left, some people keep it on the right, some people keep it on the bottom, wherever you keep it, you have your directory structure and all your files and then your code, and you're rapidly flipping around that directory structure and saying, okay, I know this is here, I know this is here. You know generally where to find your files. Even if you don't know exactly where that file is, you can use that structure. Like maybe I actually have like backends, or let's say source, backend, and then models is under that. Oops, whoa. This is not a, not something that likes multi-tab. So the idea there then is you've got your models, and I know, okay, models is usually a backend thing because I might actually have some front-end models too. Who knows? I might. Also realizing that this is text edit and this is rich text. This is a rich text file. You should never save code as a rich text file because it contains formatting that causes issues, but that's neither here nor there. If I need to look at my models, I know they're under source because it's source code. It's backend because it's a database thing, and it's probably under models because it's a model. Even if I've got 100 other folders in here, which is be unlikely for these top levels, I can still find what I'm looking for because of the structure. Okay, then maybe I actually have some controller logic for my APIs, and I have game APIs. This is also game.code, but it's under controller, which tells me that's APIs and not models, or controllers rather, which are a little different. That helps. Like maybe can start game goes under there. And then I have start game, which also goes under there. But if I'm having get user stats, that would be under user controllers. And this really helps me because if I'm doing it in a way that makes sense to me, or I understand the structure, I can generally find any function, because if someone says, hey, there's a problem with the user stats, can you figure that out? The API is returning something wrong. I'm not going to look here immediately. I might look here, but I'm not going to be floundering around. I'm going to say, oh, it's the API, which means it's going to be the controller, which means that code is probably here. Even if the bulk of that code isn't there, at least the initial function, the entry point is here. And that's really helps you with debugging, because when you're debugging, you have to find where the flow starts in order to figure out what the problem is most of the time. And so doing a really nice structure like this really helps. Front end is a little bit less structured than back end in many cases because of the components. What I usually do there, so let's say we have front end, I will often have a views, and that contains like, I'm going to use JS here because it's a front end, which means it's probably going to be a JavaScript file or TypeScript. And then let's say these are going to be like large main viewports that the user will do a couple actions on, but that generally they'll correspond to a specific URL path, something like that. Then I might have components, which could have like map, button, things like that. Just components. Some people do reusable components versus specific components. And these components themselves may also be directories. Like for example, in AngularJS, you have 3 files per component. So each component is going to be a directory. Totally fine. That's how I like doing it. And then, you know, I might have, because I use React a lot, my contexts and utils as folders. If I know something's in utility, I know exactly where to put it. If I'm looking for context, I know exactly where the contexts are. I know where my components are. I may even subdivide the components depending on if they're grouped together. I know where my views are. And this helps me figure out very quickly where code is, where certain components live, so that I can debug them very effectively. So generally, you want to break up your source code across multiple files and put those files in reasonably named files and directories so that you can just figure out where the heck anything is. That becomes really helpful, again, when we're trying to reduce our cognitive load. This structure, each one of these files, like game.code here may be 500 lines of code. I shouldn't have to scroll through all of that to find something that has to do with the user or something that has to do with the front end even. So that's kind of a primer on how to split your code apart and how to make your pseudocode exist across multiple, or not just your pseudocode, your code exists across multiple files, so it's easier for you to figure out what's going on. This is part of architecture because this computer usually doesn't care about this, but architecture is not just about teaching the computer what to do. It's also about writing projects and code that are extendable easily in the future by other people. And also remember, if you are using AI for this stuff, AI is going to have an easier time if your code is in files that are named after that as well, because it's also looking at your file structure to figure out where things are. It does do more deeper searches for things, but if your file is named controller/game, it's gonna home in on that and pick that up. So having a good file structure is not just for you, the developer, it's also for your AI tools. Anyway, I hope this is helpful, and I'll see y'all next time.